Megalights set up in Unreal Engine 5. Let's go. So there'll be a couple of technical things that we'll touch upon while doing this. I'll briefly go over them, but I will provide sources for additional reading. So the first thing we do is we go to Edit, Project Settings. First thing we want to do is enable hardware ray tracing. This is it here. So if you check that on, what Unreal Engine will do is it'll ask you to restart. So we won't restart immediately just now because there's a couple other things we need to enable. So for those of you that are unaware, ray tracing is the process tracing paths of light from the camera to the scene. It's casting or tracing of rays that formulates a technique in rendering that simulates the lighting of a scene by producing physically accurate shadows, reflections, and indirect lighting. So again, I've got a link down below on that if you want to hear more about that, or read about it rather. So we'll enable that. Next thing we're going to type in is SM6, which is Shader Model 6. This should be enabled automatically. If it's not, check that as well. And essentially, the Shader Model 6, it's a graphics programming model that enhances rendering capabilities and performance. So this actually supports Nanite and Lumen for global illumination, which is what we're going to use with the Megalights here. So once that's done, the last thing to do as well is, of course, get Megalights and check that on as well. I've got all these checked on automatically because I've restarted the engine and made those changes. So once you've enabled all those three things, restart the engine and come back in here. So now that that's enabled, the next thing you'll want to do is get a post-process volume. If you don't have the place actors window up here, just click window, place actors, and this window will appear. So again, if you go into search here, post-process volume, you click and drag it in. I'm going to hit G for game. I'm going to delete this just now because I've already got it loaded here. So in my case here, what I would do is once the volume's down, type in exposure and enable all three things here. So this is manual. I've set mine to 8. This might differ depending on the scene that you're working with and applying the physical camera. Because if we don't make this manual, Unreal Engine will try and correct the exposure automatically. And of course, it'll go from light to dark depending where you're looking. It can be quite distracting. So if I enable that, that fixes this. The next thing we want to do is type in unbound and make sure this is checked. So this means that this will affect the entire scene, no matter where this post-process volume has been placed. Next thing we do is search for Megalights, so I can enable it here. And the good thing is we can toggle on and off Megalights with this post-process volume here. So now that we've set that up, the next thing we need to do is we actually need to set our lights up to actually work with Megalights. So I've got two different light types. I've got both point and spotlights. So I'm going to just select all the point lights first. In the details tab, search Megalights. Let's enable that. And we'll go into spotlights, do the same thing, type in Megalights and allow it. What I'll also do is I enable virtual shadow maps, so these work well with Nanite and Lumen as well. Sometimes you may get errors coming up here about VSM, which is virtual shadow mapping. So you can fix that issue by enabling this with all the lights here. I've actually got documentation down below which talks about how virtual shadow maps were used in Fortnite and also just what virtual shadow maps are. But essentially they're a rendering technique that allow you to get more accurate shadows using the virtual shadow mapping. So I'm going to select all the point lights again here and just enable virtual shadow mapping as well. That's now set up. And the next thing we need to do is we need to go into search, type in Megalights, make sure that's enabled there. And that is our Megalight setup more or less done here. So the next thing we want to do is we want to look at optimization and see how this affects the scene that we're in. So the quickest way to show our frames per second here, if we push Ctrl Shift H, that'll display our frames per second here. or in the console command down here, you could put stat space FPS. This will toggle it on and off. But I prefer Control Shift H. It's just much easier. And so if we enable and disable the Megalights, you'll see that the frames will actually change here. So if I disable it, you can see we've got about a 20 to 30%, sorry, 20 to 30 frames per second performance hit here. And you can see we're getting this virtual shadow mapping error that I was talking about before. But essentially what this is saying is that there's too many lights all in the one scene that are overlapping together and it's not working. But this, of course, is where Megalights comes in and fixes this. We've enabled virtual shadow mapping in our lights here in the scene. Push G. We can toggle on and off. So when you enable this, it'll take about 10 seconds here for this error to go away. There we go, and that's it gone. So there you go, you can see it's a massive difference with Megalights here. Yeah, so we're getting about 20 or 30% frames. And like I say, there's about between 60 and 70 lights in here. So the game's going to run much better with Megalights on. Now, one thing I was going to show was if you go into Lit, Optimization, View Modes, and Light Complexity, for some reason, when you're using spotlights, when I've tried enabling and disabling Megalights with the light complexity here, it seems to crash the engine. I don't know why, but that is another way to actually assess how well your lights are in the scene. So what I'll do is I'll show the light complexity, but I'm going to disable the spotlights. I'm assuming it's the Megalights feature here that's causing the crash, so I'm going to disable those just now. You'll get a much better idea of how this looks. So if we go to Lit, Optimization, View Modes, it's light complexity, but also the shortcut's Alt-7. So here you go, this is a kind of visual look at the lights and what they're doing. So you can see there's a lot of overlap in here. We've got this kind of temperature bar down the bottom here that kind of shows bad performance versus good performance. So anything that's white, anything on the far right here, it's really bad. And anything that's dark here is really good. So you can see kind of at the back here, and that's fine. You can actually toggle from the light complexity to just normal lit mode, which is Alt-4. So I push Alt-4, go back to lit mode, Alt-7 takes us back in here. So again, just to reiterate, when I check Megalights with spotlights and try to use light complexity, it breaks the engine. Now obviously Megalights is still a feature that's been developed, so it's not fully fleshed out yet. So there will be kinks here and there, and we have to just kind of work around that to get this working. Okay, so I'm going to just enable this. Actually, let's not enable the spotlights right now. Let's go back to Lit. Select all the spotlights. Allow Megalights. Okay, so we've looked at two ways to look at performance. So if we pull Control Shift H, we've got the FPS counter, and then we have also our light complexity. We can get a visual look at our performance. The last thing we can look at is the rendering time for each frame. So this is what's called GPU profiling. And essentially what the engine's doing is it shows you how long it takes to render, objects, lights, all these sorts of things. They both impact CPU and or GPU or graphics card. I've got documentation down below that goes into much greater detail in this. It's like a whole topic in its own. So I highly recommend that you go down and read that. So what we're going to do is we're essentially going to get two different stat readings that will compare the Megalights on and then Megalights off. In fact, we'll probably start with Megalights off first. So I'm just going to double check my lights here. Yeah, they're on. So we close that. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to disable Megalights here. Then we're going to go down to our command down here and type in profile GPU and then press enter. So you'll get this dialog box that will come up here, and we're going to click down here and look for scene. Scroll down a bit more. Where are you? Rendering, yeah, render deferred lighting. So in a nutshell, it's a rendering technique that calculates lighting for a scene in a second pass after the geometry has been rendered. Again, I've got documentation down below and you can have a look at that in more detail as to what that's actually doing. So we're just interested in the lights. So in this case, we've got direct lighting. So this is our point lights and our spotlights, everything that's in the scene. So you can see it's 4.36 milliseconds. So that sounds like not a lot of time, but milliseconds really count, especially when it comes to optimization. Every millisecond counts. You'll hear technical artists and programmers talk about it if you're working at a studio. It's really, really important. And although myself, I come from an artist background, I think for all artists, it's good to at least have some kind of idea of what's going on here. You don't have to know the ins and outs of it, but I think it's just good to be aware of it, and it's just generally good practice just when you're putting your scenes together. So we've essentially got a snapshot here, 4.36 milliseconds. I'm going to grab the tab here for GPU Visualizer. We'll snap it up here. I'm then going to close this down. So to calculate this profile here, it may take you longer or shorter depending on the machine that you're working on. So we'll keep that up here. We're going to go back to Outliner. Now we've got our PostProcess Volume here. I'm now going to enable it again. So again, you might see this error up here, but it will disappear after 10 seconds. We'll go back down to console command here, profile GPU, enter. There we go. So it's the exact same process here. We're then going to this builder, going to scene, scroll down, and we are looking for render deferred lighting. Now we've got Megalights here now, so we want to click this instead. And look at that, so that's 0.81 milliseconds. So it's much quicker that Unreal Engine 5 is rendering these lights against the geometry. So we'll pop that over there as well. Oh, hasn't worked at all. Yep, so direct lighting's 4.36 milliseconds, whereas Megalights is 0.81. So it is just more efficient. And the good thing is we can get more complex light scenes here. Again, there's about 60 or 7 lights here. Sorry, 60 to 70 lights here. And, you know, the game's run really nice and smooth. You can see up here. Oh, we're going to pop in there a wee bit. But we are getting really high frames, which is what you want. And the shadows and the lightings look really good. So hopefully this has been a useful guide for you to get started with Megalights and just some of the technical breakdowns of all the different aspects that are involved making the Megalights and setting it all up. Thanks for watching.